an art collective, weren't you, originally?
I would say that was more the intent from the beginning. I mean, the Residents have always had a very kind of, for as fanciful as they are, have always had a fairly keen grasp on reality in terms of what had to be done. And, while their intention was to really be more of an arts group or an arts collective, and I think in reality that's about as true of a, three-word description as you can come up with. On the other hand, they were keenly aware that they had to be marketed in some way.
Yeah.
That gave them a niche or a category in the world that allowed them to exist and, pay rent.
Yeah.
Pay child support and alimony, whatever, buy food in the grocery store. So, being categorized as a band, that gave them, even though their territory was, beyond left field, gave something that people could hold on to and say, okay, I understand what this is. And, plus the fact, too, that they were and always have been extreme music fans. So it's not like the idea of music and the band was completely an artifice. It was coming from something real in terms of what they cared about. But at the same time, it's a very narrow category relative to what their values and ideas and ambitions were.
So, was part of the mystique because of sort of an image, or was there an element of shyness as well? Did you, prefer to keep away from?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the reality was that when the Residents started, they couldn't play anything. And a lot of their, from a musical point of view, they in a way they were sort of prescient in terms of seeing the direction that music was going in terms of multi-track recording. And so they just had this intuitive sense that there was interesting music that could be made in a multi-track environment. And ultimately, they really didn't have to know how to play, or at least not any more than enough to record something, in order to be able to fulfill that vision. But at the same time, I think they were somewhat shy and embarrassed over the fact that they couldn't play, right. And they didn't try to perform publicly for 10 years, and they didn't really perform until the advent of the sampler, and the sampler then allowed them to sample their tapes, which were very complex multi-track recordings, but they could sample that, and while it wasn't necessarily a faithful rendition of what they did in the recording studio, it was a whole lot closer to it than what they could do if they just tried to sit down and play a keyboard or play a guitar. So yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, the conceit of anonymity created a huge veil that a lot of different things could happen behind.
I see, yeah.
It sort of allowed them camouflage and concealment in a way that really worked with their artistic vision.
Do you think it's ever been an handicap, the mystery side of it? Do you think it's ever been a detrimental to your careers?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, once again, part of the reality of in the same way that they had to figure out a way to market themselves. Part of what goes with that marketing is personalities that are marketable and hopefully charming and charismatic.
Yeah.
And when all you have is faceless nobodies, well, on the surface that can be kind of interesting and charming, but it doesn't really go very far.
Right. So, yeah.
And so ultimately that created the necessity of me or Hardy Fox or somebody else stepping out and speaking for the residents.
I see. Yeah.
So that there was. I mean, in other words, if you can't do interviews, ultimately nobody's going to write about your band or your albums or anything.
Yeah.
And so that public relations interface becomes a necessity.
When the residents get together to make anything, is it quite a democratic process, or is there a leader that sort of, leads the progress?
Well, it has changed and evolved a lot over the years. And in the beginning, there was 4, and it was an incredibly democratic process. The residents, as I said before, they couldn't play, but they knew that if they pursued this, their vision, their artistic vision, if they pursued that, ultimately they would create the idea of a group, but it would be a group based on the values that they created among themselves.
I see.
It would not be based on the values of what music is from the outside world's point of view. And they were very charmed and intrigued by that idea. They came from this place of saying that everybody could do everything. It's just a matter of whether you pursue it or not. Some people may be more talented than others, but if you pursue something long enough, you can create some level of competence around it. And once again, by doing this in this very kind of closed group, they would create something that was very unique. And it's sort of like that was a very idealized vision that they came to realize basically didn't work in real life.
Right.
And the shortcoming of that is that while everybody can do everything, everybody doesn't necessarily do everything very well, and more importantly, everybody doesn't necessarily want to do everything.
Yeah.
In the long term. And so ultimately what happened was things, instead of being this very democratic group of 4, all for one for all, things started breaking down into more, who's actually interested in doing stuff. And so jobs and creative paths started splintering.
What sort of values did you want to promote in your work?
Their influences were extremely broad. Everything from Sun Ra and Moondog, Harry Partch on one hand, to big band brass, rock and roll on the other side. So, in a lot of ways, what they are is a distillation of all that influence. But at the same time, they wanted the music to be unique and original, but they also felt that, from the point of view of seeing themselves more as an art group, they also saw the need for really interesting and distinctive album covers, and a very unique visual persona for the band, and then ultimately performance too. And for the first 4 years of their existence, they worked on a film project, Violence Fast, and so they really saw that as a part of their vision too. I think a lot of the reality was that by maintaining, by following the development of multi-track recording, they were able to, at least from a consumer point of view, they were able to stay on top of that technology much easier than they were able to stay on top of film technology, which honestly was, for the most part, beyond their reach financially. Yeah, well, technology was always important for them, and to me, I think what's part of interesting about the Residents is that they would juxtapose a very kind of primitive sense of values in terms of what they were capable of doing upon a more high-tech way of expressing themselves. And so there's a lot of tension that gets created in between this coach that could do in the recording studio to just walk up on a stage in front of an audience with nothing but instruments that they knew they couldn't play. There wasn't a lot of confidence there. And, even when they did their first tour, which was the Bowl Show tour in 82 and 83, they carried 22 gigantic backdrops around and millions of props, and ultimately the music of that era, I think it's really quite interesting. But there wasn't a sense of confidence that the music alone would carry it. They needed a lot of smoke and mirrors to deflect away from the fact that they couldn't play. And to their credit, they got past that fairly quickly. And when you get to the 13th anniversary tour, which was the next one, it's much more bare bones. Was infinitely more successful, at least from a financial point of view.
How would you say that the music of the Residents has changed over the years?
I don't know. I suppose I would have to say more complex. Initially, their stuff was made up of building track upon track upon track of things that were really very simple, but created a kind of a complex sound through layering. And I think ultimately their ideas and their abilities to realize those ideas have become more complex over time. But also, too, they work a lot with sampling now, and so honestly, they don't have to play as much if they're. I mean, they do, and their playing has gotten better. At the same time, the whole world is available in terms of samples with people who are excellent players, and so and there are a lot of complex ideas in that stuff that they then take and rearrange and reorganize for their own compositions or sensibilities, and there's interesting complexity that comes from that.
Right. Okay. And when synth music started to appear in the early 80s and late 70s, did you have any opinion on that at all? Was there any music of that ilk that you were attracted to?
Well, I'm sure there was. I mean, I think, I have to think about it. Kraftwerk is from that era.
Yeah.
And, they were pretty big Kraftwerk fans.
Mm-hmm.
That was like, I think, disco era, the beginning of disco era. And I know Donna Summer was somebody, I think Giorgio Moroder, who was her producer,
mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think they really enjoyed a lot of his stuff. from the point of view of producing and arranging.
Yeah.
Probably. If I gave it some thought, I could probably come up with a lot of other stuff too. I know. Does Barry White go back that far? I know Barry White was a big influence at one point. But that was also, around the. I don't know. I guess Moondog. Well, he preceded that, but then he went forward through that era too.
Yeah.
So he was certainly not. I think maybe like 69 and 70 is when he released his two albums on Columbia that sort of brought him to more public attention in a way that nothing else did.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm sure there's stuff. If I went back and thought about it, I could find stuff from that era that was that the Residents liked. They were getting into a lot of what I think at the time was called world music. With more ethnic sensibilities, and you see that in Eskimo clearly. I think that was definitely a time when they were branching out from more Western music and pop music and getting into more, like I say,
sort of ethnic-based
ethnic music or world music.
Yeah. You're quite big fans of Captain Beefheart, aren't you?
Yeah. Yeah, they were big fans of Captain Beefheart.
Did you ever work with him?
No. It's interesting. Eric Feldman, Eric is essentially the Residents' producer at this point. It really started out more with the Residents kind of producing themselves. But then over time, Hardy Fox, my former partner, more and more became the producer, and Hardy, developed a very unique kind of like sound landscape. And when Hardy retired, which was at the end of 2016, Hardy's involvement was one of the things that was most difficult for the Residents to replace.
Yeah.
Because he brought such a unique ear and sound to what they did. Ultimately, Eric Feldman, who had worked with the Residents in various things, they came to realize that he was not only a producer, but had a lot of sensibilities in common with Hardy. And so Eric has produced with the Residents really for the last three albums since Hardy left. And Eric was playing with Captain Beefheart when he was 20 years old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he lived right down the street from Captain Beefheart.
Wow.
And, Eric is somebody that, Eric and I are fairly close these days, and so I hear a lot of stories. And I think he's somebody that was interested in music from an incredibly young age. And so ultimately, I think he discovered that Don was living down the street from him and kind of made friends with him. And I guess at the point where Don's original Magic Band broke up, and he needed a band to be able to, go in the studio and tour and whatever. And Eric got involved with him and became his band leader. Like I said, I think that was maybe the early '80s. I'm not sure. And Eric was also band leader for Snakefinger. And a sad footnote to his story of his involvement with Snakefinger is that he's the one that found Philip's body.
Oh, really?
In the rooms of a venue where they were performing when he had a heart attack and died in 1988 or something like that.
All right, yeah. Are you using the latest software to make music?
Yeah. So ultimately, are you saying like what kind of technology are the Residents primarily using at this point?
That's right, yeah.
typical digital. I think Digital Performer and Logic. I think is primarily what's being used at this point.
Where did the eyeball and the tuxedos? Who came up with that idea?
Well, the original idea, in the same way that the Residents wanted a completely unique sound with every album, they wanted a completely different and unique look. And so I was the person that was pretty much putting that stuff together. I've always been the primary visual person. When it came time for their Eskimo album, they felt like they really needed, they had basically been working on that album for 4 years and were very pleased and happy and proud when they finally wrestled it into some level of submission. And, they really wanted a unique sound for that. A unique
look
and cover.
Yeah.
And so the original idea was a silver globe, almost like a Christmas ornament or something, but head sized. So like a silver globe with a tuxedo and top hat. And so it became my job to figure out how to actually create that. So I went down to L.A. and I went to Hollywood and started essentially talking to professional costume people down there. And ultimately, everybody told me, you can't do that. That won't work. It's too hard to see out of something like that. Their breath will make it fog up on the inside, making it even harder to see. It's hard to breathe. You can't hear. And so I took that information back, and there was a lot of discussion back and forth, and ultimately, I came up with the idea of, about an eyeball instead, and everybody loved it, and it's almost as difficult as the Silver Globe, but it does have a little porthole in the very front, where it has black mesh over it, so you can actually see out through a little porthole. It gets tiresome to wear after long periods of time. I mean, the common misconception is that the Residents perform in those, and while they have performed in them, they've never performed in them for more than 15 or 20 minutes at a time, because it's just not feasible. It's not realistic. But ultimately, it just, once again, that whole idea of a different look, the whole theme of the eyeball with the top hat, in a way, it captured people's imagination so much more than anything else that it became then just, that became the trademark for the band.
Yeah, and, sorry, carry on. I was going to say, one of them got stolen, didn't they?
Well, actually, 2 of them have gotten stolen.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah, and one got stolen in 1985, and it was returned, actually.
Oh.
But then there was one that was in a museum show that was, and this was just about 4 or 5 years ago, and the museum show had traveled, I think it started in Cincinnati, and it went from Cincinnati to New York, and from New York to Melbourne, and then from Melbourne to Seattle. And then the eyeball was on the way back to me, but the people who were sending it had not done a very good job of communicating with me.
Right.
And I was out of town on vacation when the thing arrived. I didn't even know that I didn't even know it was coming back until I got an email from FedEx saying that it had been delivered. At which point I freaked out because I knew that he was just sitting on a landing out in front of my house.
Right.
And I immediately sent people by to retrieve it, and it was gone. I mean, somebody driving by in a car saw this box up there, and these were like big, fairly large, black, strong shipping containers.
Yeah.
And maybe I thought there was some kind of like valuable equipment in there or something. I have no idea. All I know is it disappeared. And so anyway, yeah.
As a band, you've worked on quite a few film scores, haven't you? How did those come about, and how do you think they differed from making an album, let's say?
Yeah, it's very different.
Yeah.
It's very different because, as a soundtrack person, your job is to support the vision of the director.
Yeah.
And so, it's a very different mindset than doing your own vision. You have to feel like, and more importantly, the director has to feel like what you're doing reinforces what he wants to do. With a soundtrack, is you're looking for the underlying emotional reality or feeling of a scene, and so your idea, your job is to once again reinforce or underscore whatever that emotion is. And I mean, I'm a big lover of soundtracks. One of, and as are the residents. I mean, one of my big heroes musically is Ennio Morricone. But I love Ennio Morricone's work. I love Nina Rota's work. But Elmer Bernstein. I mean, there's a long list of soundtrack people that I can talk about for hours. But I feel like in some ways the art of the soundtrack is being lost because it just seems like directors, by the time it gets to doing a soundtrack, so much has been invested in a movie that directors don't take the risks that they used to with the music. And so soundtrack work is a lot more subtle. And it still works, and it can still be good, but it's not as distinctive in many ways as it used to be.
Yeah. Is there any soundtracks you'd have loved to have done for any particular films?
Oh gosh, I could probably go back and list dozens of them. I mean, in some ways, the first things that come to mind are things that already have great soundtracks, and it would be crazy to compete with that.
Yeah.
I think if I was going to take that question seriously, I'd have to go back and look at movies that I've liked that I thought didn't have that interesting of soundtracks. That you could go in and take a different approach and create something more unique. But I'd have to give that some thought.
Are there any musical collaborations you wish you'd done with any particular artists?
There is a guy that I'm extremely interested in working with that you probably never heard of. His name is Ego Plum.
Oh no, I'm not familiar with him.
It's just like it sounds. Ego, E-G-O, Plum, P-L-U-M. And right now, he is primarily doing soundtrack work for cartoons in L.A.
Oh, right, okay.
And I think he's doing SpongeBob.
All right.
He's doing a lot of other stuff.
Yeah.
And he's somebody I've been in touch with. He's fairly young by my standards. I think he's probably like maybe his mid-40s. But I've been in touch with him for about 20 years, and he just has a very interesting sensibility. And I'm thinking at some point there could be an interesting collaboration with him. I mean, we talk on a regular basis, and at some point I think that's probably going to come up. I'm going to have to go at this point, Sean. I have some things that I have to get to.
Okay, well, thank you for your time again,